In this video, I'm going to be talking about reduce, the gigachad of array methods. It is the gigachad of all array methods because it's very powerful. It allows you to transform an array into anything you want, into another array or an object or a number, string, anything you want, anything you imagine. In this video, I'm going to be showing you transforming an array into an object as well as into a number. So let's start with the first example, transforming an array into an object. So the first example that we're going to look at is turning this array of cars into an object that tells me how many Hondas I have, how many Toyotas, how many Fords. Now I added some console logs up front, but don't mind them at this point. Just ignore the right portion of the screen. Just let's focus on what's going on inside of this reduce here. So reduce accepts a function, and the first argument of that function is the accumulator. You can think of the accumulator as a snowball that's slowly but surely getting bigger and bigger with each iteration, and it gets so big that it can destroy a town in the Alp mountains. And the second argument here is just an element that we're gonna consider. You are probably not subscribed, and I'm trying to get to 1,000 subscribers, so I would really appreciate your support. Thank you. The element in any given iteration. Now, because we're dealing with a array of cars, I just call it car. If that was an array of vegetables, we would call it vegetable. There's also index and an array, but I'm not going to use them here, but just so we know, this is what's available. So now let's take a look at the console log. So I described the accumulator as a snowball that at first is small but slowly grows bigger and bigger. And the official definition of the accumulator is that this is the returned value of the operation from the previous iteration. And if you pass in this guy here, this optional initial value, this is what the accumulator at first will be. So let's take a look at the console log. As you can see here, we are at our first iteration here because we are dealing with the first element of our array. And at this point, accumulator is just an empty object because this is what we pass in as the initial value. And then we are doing some magic here, and well, it's not really magic, but all that really happens here is that if a given car make, for example, Honda, is not present in our object, we add it. We add the value 0 at first, and then we just increment that value. So if there's no Hondas in our object, we just assign Honda 1. But if there was more Hondas, then we wouldn't do that here. If we would just increment the value. And at the end of this logic here, we can see that our accumulator has Honda and with the value 1 inside. Now, if you remember, I said that accumulator is the returned value of the previous operation in the previous iteration. And that's what's happening here. We're in our second iteration, and the accumulator before this logic here is what was being returned to us at the end of the first iteration. And then we are doing this logic here, this incrementation, and this is how our accumulator looks like at the end. And then in the third iteration, this is how our accumulator looks before and after. And then this is the final value. Now let's see what exactly the reduce method returns to us. So this is the result of reduce my English. And as you can see, this is what was the value of the accumulator at the end of the last iteration. So that was the example of turning an array into an object. Now let's turn an array of simple numbers into also a number. So I allowed myself to get rid of the console logs from the previous example, and I added some here in the second example. And you can see the same principle happening here. So at first, because we pass in the optional, and I'm going to explain why it's optional and what happens when you don't pass it in. So I pass in the optional initial value being just 0, and this is the initial value of the accumulator at first. And then at the end, it's slowly growing bigger and bigger and bigger. And at the end, it returns our value, which is a sum of all of these numbers here. Now, I mentioned this. Why is my nose so itchy? Now, I mentioned this a couple of times already, that the second argument here is optional. So now let's see what happens when you don't pass it in. What happens is that the accumulator takes the first element from the array, and this is its initial value. Now, this works only if we have an array of primitives and we want to get the same, well, the primitive of the same type. So like in this example, we have an array of numbers. Numbers are primitives, and we wanted to also get a number. But if we wanted to get a string or an object, this wouldn't work. And now let's see what happens when we don't pass in the optional argument here in the first example. So something weird happened. And what happened is that we appended Ford and Toyota into the first element of our array. Why did that happen? Because again, if we don't pass in this optional initial value argument, the first element of our array becomes the initial value for the accumulator. So that's why we have to pass in the object. So yes, it is optional if you want, in a sense that without it reduce works, but it's not really optional in the sense that we want to get the result that you want. And sure, in this example, we can get the result we want, but in a more complex one, we need that optional initial value. So now let's move on to the implementation. So this is how I implemented reduce. I pass in an array, and I also name it very creatively, my reduce. The first argument is an array that we want to consider. The second argument is the function. I call it reduce function. This is where the actual magic happens. And the third argument, because it's optional, I assign undefined to it, meaning that if I don't pass any value into it, it will be undefined. It can be null as well. It doesn't really matter. This is just an example. So first we check if our array has any elements. If not, it makes sense to me to return the initial value. Now, the native reduce function will throw an error in that case. I didn't think it was important enough. Whatever, it doesn't matter. So first I define those variables here and I check my initial value. So if the initial value is not undefined, so therefore it is something was passed in, the accumulator becomes that initial value. And our index, what index? The for loop index is equal to 0. We assign 0 to it. Why? Because we will be starting from the first element. Now the question is, in what case would you not start from the first element? Well, in the case if there's no initial value passed, and this is exactly covered here. So if there's no initial value passed, the first value for the accumulator becomes the first element of the array. And then the index is 1. So we're starting from the second element from our index, because if we already took the first element from our array, we cannot consider it again and do some kind of operation on it. It just doesn't make sense. So the for loop here goes over either the first or starts from the first or the second element. And it just takes each element from that array in any given iteration and just passes it into the reduce function where the magic happens, along with the accumulator as the first argument, the element as the second argument and index, and I guess also the initial array. I guess that's the official implementation. And then at the end we return the result, so the accumulator. So now let's see, well, I already have it here. We see that this works in the first case. So I used my reduce function here, and I pass in the exact same logic as in the native one, and I got the same result. As well as in the second example of array of numbers. And let me just console log this real quick. And as you can see here, by the way, I got rid, in the meantime, in the magic of video editing, I also got rid of the console logs here inside. So my reduce function also returned the same. Well, actually, now I'm sure that it works the same. So that's how I implement it, and that's pretty much the reduce. Now, one extra tip that I can give you is that I usually do not call this guy here the accumulator. Why? It's because reduce was very confusing to me. Why is my nose so itchy? I should probably clean this room once in a while. So the reduce function, well, method. So the reduce method was a bit confusing to me, if I'm being honest. I didn't really get it. What helped me get it was naming the first argument, so the accumulator, the same as the result of reduce. So in this case, I'm trying to get the car index. That's just how I called it. And that's how I would call the first argument here, car index. And with that, it was a bit easier for me to get it. Now, some linters will not like it. And in my current job, the linter doesn't like it. So I would call it like car list or C index or something like that. I just don't like to call it accumulator, but that's the official docs call it the accumulator. So I went with that. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So thank you for watching. Thank you for being here. I appreciate you clicking on my video. Make sure to like and also leave a comment if your own implementation of reduce is different or if I missed anything in your view. And yeah, I'll see you next time. Thank you.